So I'm going to hand over to one of my colleagues, Dumi Senda, who's at the University of Oxford, and he's going to get us into a creative and cultural mood by reading a poem.
Thank you so much. I'm usually told that I don't need a mic, and I think they usually like to put this to the side. But if you can't hear me very well, please do let me know. But I'm usually quite loud. Hi. My poem is called, in keeping with the event today, it's called "The Song of Livelihood." Zimbabweans are singing again. The Song of Livelihood. Zimbabweans are singing again. The dust settled, the unsettled, fatal, kettle on the boil, ready for boys heading home, the kettle, embattled, nettle-biting warriors, nomadic, coming home, home comes, women inside, ululating. Those who can ululate, you can. Men returning from dying. Cold fending. Men were supposed to whistle them, but never mind. Cold fending children in a child. And the drifter with a goatee, smoking chalice, stroking his beard. The neighbors would think he's weird. The ones who never feared would cheer. Water, motoring tummies of mummies, sweating for very little. And little boys and girls at the kings lining for Stuart Little. And those piling king to get a lot. They go to a lot. They go to a lot of trouble to win the lotto lot. Hello Moto, the Bible. The ones getting inside it and trouble. Mashona, Ndebele, Manika. The Lord for whom it is cool to say, Ayo. So I can join about. The older Lord. To them who is colder, Nanga, Maprofita, payroll people and people on the payroll. Inflatable things on rapturous things. And the trouble ensuing if they rapture. Matoe, Matamba, Makwakwa, Makashaba, Makunguju, Makepekepe 1, Dynamos 2. Amashola Jama, Emma Gumeni, Iboso, Detembo by Babadembo. Tururu, Tururu. That's true. Zimbabweans are singing again the song of livelihood. Thank you so much. Enjoy the program.
My presentation is entitled Reaping What You Sow. And what I'm going to be presenting to you today is my take on the legacy of violence and insecurity that came from a period called the land seizure era and has transitioned into modern Zimbabwean farming. So the land seizure era is a term that I used when I was doing my doctorate here at Oxford, and it captures the period from about February 2000 when Zimbabwean commercial farms began being seized en masse, and ended roughly in about March 2008 when most commercial farms had been seized and much of the violence that had been occurring in rural areas had shifted to predominantly more urban environments. In my presentation today, I want to set the stage and just talk to you a little bit about the data. What's the data that I'm using that's underpinning my presentation, and indeed what's the data that underpins my doctorate. I then would like to just pop up to the surface and speak a little bit more generally and talk about what farmers anywhere in the world need to be successful. So kind of get that top level perspective of what are the major ingredients that farmers tend to need in order to be successful as commercial operators. And then thirdly, I'd like to shift gears a bit and go into a deep dive and look at the factors that led to farmer evictions during the land seizure era. So that's again the period from about 2000 to approximately 2008. So what drove farmers off their land? And then to look at some of those elements and try and see which of those are coming through and impacting and manifesting in Zimbabwe's agricultural environment today. So with that, let's talk about data for a second. As all of us know, all of us who are interested and do research in Zimbabwe, it's an incredibly contested space. Whether we're talking about the land issue in general, we're talking about racial issues, we're talking about the colonial era, the post-colonial era, there are an awful lot of deeply held, entrenched views. And what I aimed to do in my doctorate was to gather as much robust data as I possibly could in order to cut through a lot of the opinions and try to have more of a data-led argument. And I'm sure all of you are doing the same thing. But I just want to lead you through what I did in my research here in the Department of Sociology. So first, I personally undertook 111 interviews. These were fairly lengthy interviews, averaging about 2 hours each, of individuals from all the key stakeholder areas in Zimbabwe. So I looked at individuals from the State Security Service, so the CIO and military intelligence. I spoke to farmers. I spoke to farm workers, of course, people in ZANU-PF, people in the NDC. So again, trying to give a wide range of different qualitative perspectives. I then layered that on top of a set of quantitative data. So it took actually a couple of years to locate farmers because they've since moved to about 26 countries worldwide. But I ended up doing a survey of about 34% of Zimbabwe's commercial farmers that were operating in the year 2000. So this was to give a quantitative foundation to the research. And then the third data set was looking at a set of data that came from an excellent source, the Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO Forum. And I coded those data and used those figures to come up with 21,491 instances of violence, of different types of violence, and I'll lead you through those. And these are depicted on 92 geographical maps. And this gives a geographical perspective of violence and its proliferation, but also a longitudinal perspective as well. So all of this underpinned my study, which was looking at how the farm invasions began, who was affected, how were people affected differently, how were different regions of Zimbabwe impacted, and some of the underpinning reasons for those differences. So, thinking a bit more globally, what do farmers need in order to be successful? If we think anywhere around the world, there's some real patterns that obviously emerge. So climate, it goes without saying, everyone think of climate. The better your climate, the more likely you are to have higher yields. The better the soil you have, the more likely you are to have higher yields. The better your training, the more capital you have. All of these are factors which are obvious ones that lead to a farmer tending to have a more successful time in commercial operations. But I think the ones I would like us to focus on in particular in the presentation today is a stable economic environment. One of the elements I'd really like to impress upon everyone today is that farming is a long time horizon profession. What I mean by that is even if you look at the time span to grow one crop, you're typically looking at several months. So it's many months before you see any return on your investment. And if you look at other longer term investments, for example, say you build a dam, or you invest in irrigation, or you want to grow a citrus crop, by the time you plant that first seed, it might be 7 to 10 years before you harvest your first orange or your first grapefruit. So these are long-term investments, and what that means is that it's absolutely essential that you have a relatively stable economic environment, and that will facilitate stable borrowing prices and allow you to pay your workers and operate your farm as a business over the longer term until you can recover your investments. Second, obviously, is respect for property rights. If you're going to be investing your own money or other people's money, it's absolutely essential that the law step in and provide protection. Otherwise, why would you take the risk? Thirdly, related to property rights is the enforcement of that, the security. Do you have security on your land? Are you going to face intimidation? Are your assets or are workers that work on your property going to face threats? And all of these are elements that contribute to a successful commercial operation if security is good. And fourthly, it's the supporting agriculture industry. So it's the business around the farming environment. So it could be, for example, specialist accountants, it would be agronomists, people to sell you fertilizer, people to sell you diesel fuel, people to fix your tractors, people to provide all sorts of different kinds of technical support. So So these elements come together to form some of the key ingredients that would make farmers anywhere, particularly commercial farmers, more successful. So let's go into a bit of a deeper dive into some of the elements that led to farmer evictions in Zimbabwe. Well, the first one is, I think, probably the elements that came to mind for all of you. It's the declining economic environment after 2000, after February 2000. I think the inflation level in February 2000 was about 46%, so it was already in a very severe condition when farm invasions began. But as they accelerated, forces came into play and it continued to undermine the economy. So as Zimbabwe entered into a period of hyperinflation, one has to remember that farmers are continuing to operate as a business. They're needing to pay workers, needing in many cases to borrow money from the bank, and these threats together made it incredibly difficult for farmers to keep operating. Secondly, deterioration of property rights. All of us who've researched Zimbabwe have heard many stories, and it was massively backed up in the research that I did, that the police enforcement of law became very political. So police tended to not enforce laws that were deemed political or issues that were deemed political on commercial farms. And that meant that farmers and their workers and the protection of assets severely weakened over time. Third is one that actually doesn't come up very often in research. It's the disintegration of the commercial farming community. So if you lived and worked on a farm and your friend was evicted next door, you would then lose that support. It might be if a fire broke out on your farm, you would lose the support of that person rallying people to come and support you. It might be technical assistance. Maybe someone coming in helping you fix your tractor. There could be someone at a particularly critical time helping you to plant your crops. But it was also social. It was people that you spent time with on a Saturday. Maybe your kids played together. So there's a disintegration of that community. There was a tremendously strong force in farmers being evicted. But I think the one that is in many ways most important for the presentation today was a chronic security problem. So I want to go into a bit more detail, give you a sense of what that was like. The farmers' lack of security for themselves, their families, workers on their farm, and their assets was absolutely dire. So to give you a sense of the levels of violence that were occurring in Zimbabwe during the land seizure era, in some instances I think that the level of violence has been perhaps a bit misunderstood, a bit downplayed. But in my view, it was tremendously strong. There was an enormous amount of violence of all different types occurring in Zimbabwe on the 2000 to 2008 and beyond period, particularly from that time period. You'll see on the chart here that there's a little bit of missing data in early 2000. That was an incomplete data set. I actually have some instances of data there, but I decided not to depict them because they weren't complete. But nonetheless, there's some real takeaway messages you can see here. Number one, there's a tremendous amount of violence occurring throughout this period. Number two, there are a lot of different types of violence occurring. So some very severe levels of violence, for example, politically motivated rape, torture, murder, attempted murder, but an enormous number of assaults as well. Assaults can easily be seen as being something less severe, and certainly on the hierarchy of violence they would be less severe, but it's tremendously difficult to operate with so many assaults going on. The other one is unlawful arrest. So the police using their powers to interfere in farming operations. So you can see that levels of violence obviously increased and decreased. This depended on political events normally. So if there was an election or a by-election occurring, you typically saw greater levels of violence. But the real takeaway message is there's a lot of violence and a lot of different types of violence. And it's in this environment that commercial farmers needed to keep operating. So one immediately gets a sense of the challenges there. This is a graphical depiction of the most violent month of the land seizure era. This is, of course, the presidential election time, March 2002. And you can immediately get a sense of some patterns that are emerging. One, a lot of violence, and there's a tremendous amount of violence, particularly in the Mashonaland provinces, where not all, but many of the commercial farms were located. So these maps are the ones that I coded from the Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO form data set. And by the way, if anyone would like to see the full set of maps, it's on my website. You can go and have a look. And I'd encourage you to use those data if they would be of any use to you. But again, it's a tremendous amount of different types of violence, and much of it is occurring in commercial farming areas. So let's get a more qualitative sense, particularly as it's mixed in with the survey, of what this was like. So if you were a commercial farmer, what are the kinds of things you would be experiencing? Well, in my survey of commercial farmers, 77.4% indicated that the deteriorating security condition was one of the key reasons why they were ultimately evicted. And one, I think, needs to get a sense of what that's actually like. We're not talking about someone writing you a nasty note, or someone being belligerent and getting in your face. Certainly that occurred. But one's talking about very high levels of constant, repeated types of violence. So you have instances here, abduction of family members, assaults, electrocution, attempted electrocution, crops constantly being stolen. So families were very, very vulnerable, and this was one of the most important elements of farmers deciding that ultimately they needed to leave their properties. And likewise, farmers repeatedly asserted that it was protection of workers, or the lack thereof, that was a particularly difficult problem for them. So you can imagine a farm with a homestead and the farm workers' village located nearby. It's impossible for a farmer to protect that many people when there's a breakdown of law enforcement occurring. So what was it like for workers? I want to be absolutely clear about this. The experience of farm workers was not only much more violent than those of farmers, but they experienced much more severe kinds of violence, even when one factors in the tremendous population difference between the number of commercial farmers and their family members operating and the number of workers and their family members living on commercial farms. And we're talking some pretty hardcore stuff here. One that really stands out in my mind is instances of land invaders wrapping sticks with barbed wire and then systematically beating workers with those sticks. The Colombo method of beating people underneath their feet, a tremendous amount of torture and intimidation, and the destruction of farm worker property. So that would be piling possessions into huts and setting those huts alight. So the experience of farm workers was absolutely dire. And for farmers, this was a tremendously difficult situation. They were helpless, and they realized that by their continued presence on the farm, this violence would continue. So it was a key means of evicting farmers, and it definitely worked. It definitely had an attritional effect on farmers' mentalities. Again, I've mentioned a few times commercial farming is a business. It's a very important message. You have to keep operating in this environment of tremendous conflict. And how do you keep doing that? Well, farmers found that their inability to operate in a deteriorating economic situation was an absolutely key reason why they left. So 52.9% of farmers cited that. And these quotations from farmers give you a sense of what they were experiencing: the ransacking of homes, crops being stolen, crops being burnt in the fields, tractors being stolen. So how do you operate your business with this going on? Farmers also believed that there was a breakdown in their social environment, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation. So 31.3% of farmers cited that as a key reason. Your friends leave, your neighbors leave, and you have an increasing sense of isolation. So should I stay on or should I go? What should I do? But I think really what it was a mix of all of these elements. Now, in some instances, it would be a specific act of violence or a specific issue that would evict a farmer. But often it was an attritional issue of many, many different elements all taking place: the economic, the social, and the security. Now, I know you're not supposed to read from your own slides and presentations, but if you could just indulge me in this one, because I think it actually really sums it up. Quote, this is from a farmer: "I could not farm, there was no law. They," meaning the farm invaders, "shot or snared all the game, netted the dams, cut all the trees down, burnt the farm, stole everything, intimidated my labor." Gives you, in one sentence, a kind of sense of the beleaguered nature of commercial farms facing this environment of conflict. This slide here, I think, is probably, in my opinion, the most important slide I wanted to show you today. It gives you a graphical sense of this interaction between a multitude of different types of issues undermining farmers' confidence and willingness to stay on their land. In particular, it's bringing together some of the security issues and the economic issues. So if you look at the yellow peak on the left, that is the peak of violence in the land seizure era. This is, of course, the presidential election in 2002. So you can see clearly there's a peak. Now, if violence was the only reason why farmers would have been evicted, it stands to reason that evictions would peak either before the anticipated period of violence, people knew that the presidential election was going to be a very violent time, or right afterwards, meaning you had this experience, you decided you can't cope, and you leave your farm. But in fact, that's not what the data shows. The data shows a peak of farmer evictions in about August 2002. So that raises the question, what is it about August that's so different? And it does lead one to conclude it's probably not violence alone. And the answer is most likely that August is the final month of the year before you must commit to the next year's cropping. It's a very uncertain period of whether you would see a return on that capital. And again, it raises the question, what was the impact on the commercial agriculture industry? So annual growth, these are World Bank data, certainly took a very substantial impact. There's no doubt that it impacted farmers' ability to produce crops, and this impacted the growth of Zimbabwe's agricultural industry. So shifting focus, what are some of the conditions that Zimbabwean farmers face today? Well, I think above all, the biggest challenge Zimbabwean farmers face today is that farming in Zimbabwe is no longer a scientific or a profession that is guided by the impartial interpretation of law. It's a political profession in many respects. And I think this makes Zimbabwean farming, particularly as a long-term game, very challenging indeed. So some of the issues that I think new farmers in Zimbabwe have either brought in themselves or inherited in the general environment is, number one, the legacy of violence and intimidation. In my opinion, it's created in the minds of some people a might makes right mentality. One of the more recent incidents, I spoke to a new farmer, and the farmer said to me, I seized this land from a former farmer, and now someone is trying to seize it from me. And they're using violence and intimidation against me to take the land that I had taken from someone else. And this individual found it an incredibly corrosive way to live, and an environment where this individual felt that he had no hope. He had a tremendous sense of worry, and what he wasn't thinking about is how best to grow his crops, how he could be a successful commercial farmer. I think the second is that the land claims and the business of agriculture is very politically motivated. I think all we need to do is to look at, for example, recent instances with Joyce Majuru. Joyce Majuru is in power, and she has support, and her supporters enjoy the benefits of owning parts or whole commercial farms. Her political fate has shifted. She's no longer a favoured individual, and you can then see a repercussive effect with her supporters losing their ability to lay claim to portions of commercial farms. And this is just one example that's been repeated in other instances. I think another one is the dwindling agriculture industry. The support for commercial farmers has certainly weakened. So whether it's fertilizer suppliers or specialist agronomists, many people have left the country or closed shop. This means that existing farmers have less support to enable them to be more viable commercial producers. And I think that ultimately this raises the question of how can you make long-term investments? And in my opinion, the short answer is you can't easily do that. If you have uncertainty and you need to make investments that will yield returns over 2, 5, 10 years down the road, you need security, you need assurances, and you need protection. And I think Zimbabwean farmers really baffle at the moment because they lack that. There are some exceptions, but the general rule That's a key element in Zimbabwe's agricultural environment today. I will leave it there, but thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to your questions in the Q&A.